Hey guys, tonight we begin in the candlelit corridors of Tudor England, where the air smells faintly of beeswax, fresh rushes, and the soft panic of servants trying not to spill wine on royal shoes. Outside, the towers of Hampton Court loom against a velvet sky, thick with the hush of secrets, and the distant clip-clop of horses retreating from a late council meeting. Somewhere inside, a portly man with thinning ginger hair has just tossed a chicken leg into the fireplace and demanded to be in love again. You're here for a sleep story, but tonight's history is stitched together with silk veils, diamond tears, and the clatter of far too many wedding goblets. We're talking about Henry VIII. Yes, the one who married 6 women, broke England from the Catholic Church, and probably would have had a reality show if he'd lived today. You probably won't survive this. As one of his wives, that is. But don't worry. You're just a ghostly observer, not a potential spouse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander into a court where marriage is less about love and more about politics, alliances, and producing heirs like it's a royal obligation. And spoiler alert, it is. Henry VIII isn't born wearing a crown, but he is born second in line, behind his older brother Arthur. Arthur, delicate in both health and facial expression, is betrothed young to Catherine of Aragon, a fierce, pious Spanish princess with eyebrows like calligraphy and a spine forged in Castilian fire. Catherine arrives in England expecting marriage, monarchy, and maybe a slightly better climate. What she gets is a sickly husband who dies within months. Historians still argue whether Arthur and Catherine ever consummated the marriage. Yes, that word will come up a lot tonight. But the answer to that question ends up being Henry's favourite legal excuse a few decades later. Henry becomes the new heir, and unlike Arthur, Henry is built like a show horse, athletic, charming, tall, and just narcissistic enough to believe every woman should be grateful to look at him. Catherine, now a teenage widow, lingers in England, half forgotten, her dowry half paid and her future half baked. You imagine her waiting, fingers worrying rosary beads, in cold palaces with too many drapes and not enough fires. By 1509, when Henry takes the throne, he decides to marry Catherine anyway. Romance? Maybe. Politics? Definitely. Spain is powerful, and Catherine's royal blood sweetens the pot. They marry in a flurry of banquets and jewelled prayers. You can almost taste the honey-glazed peacock served at the wedding feast, and yes, it was probably still wearing its feathers. For a time, it's actually sweet. Henry writes songs. Catherine advises on state matters. They're a golden couple, glowing with youth, potential, and the confident ignorance of people who haven't yet had their hearts slowly crushed by time and infertility. But then, no son. There are pregnancies. So many, it's almost a sleep deprivation montage. You see Catherine lying pale against linen pillows, again and again, hearing the same quiet words from physicians who mostly specialise in leeches and guesswork. One daughter, Mary, survives, but she's not the boy Henry needs to secure his dynasty. You can almost hear the palace floors groan under the weight of expectation. Still, Catherine holds on. She prays harder. She wears humility like armour. But Henry starts to drift toward court dances, toward younger women, toward theological loopholes that might excuse him from a wife whose womb, he begins to say, is cursed. He insists God is punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. Historians still debate whether this was religious conviction or just convenient theology. But let's be honest, it's probably both. Meanwhile, the court is whispering. Courtiers glance sideways. Servants pass notes faster than medieval Wi-Fi. Catherine's allies tighten their grip on rosaries. Henry's advisors start sniffing for papal annulments. And then, like a fox in ermine, enters Anne Boleyn. But shh, not yet. For now, you're still sitting beside Catherine in the flickering light, watching her write letters in both Latin and heartbreak, knowing the crown is slipping, but refusing to let go. Outside, bells ring vespers. You hear them faintly as Catherine kneels, still queen, still defiant. Henry, in another wing of the palace, is already dreaming of a second wedding. You'll get there. You step softly through a corridor of heavy tapestries, embroidered with Tudor roses and lions devouring French banners, into a chapter that starts with royal devotion and ends in emotional debris. Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England, once the daughter of two Spanish monarchs who helped unite their country under one crown and one religion, is now waiting. Always waiting. She waits for letters from Rome. She waits for Henry to visit. She waits for another chance at a miracle that will never come. You find her at a prayer desk again, her fingers moving rhythmically over wooden beads polished smooth with use and grief. The candle beside her flickers, not from wind, but from the draught of uncertainty that seems to live permanently in these rooms now. Her daughter Mary, still a child, is tucked away in another palace. Henry has moved her down the line of succession, like shoving her off the family tree and into the shrubbery. Henry, meanwhile, is pacing, not praying. You can hear his boots thudding against the stone, feel his impatience crackling like dried parchment. He's convinced himself this marriage is wrong, against God, unnatural. Not his fault, of course, never that. The man who once composed love songs for Catherine now insists he was bewitched by political necessity and needs deliverance. Enter the King's Great Matter. That's literally what everyone calls it, because if you're going to upend an entire nation's religious structure, you might as well give it a dramatic title. Henry wants an annulment. Catherine refuses. Not because she wants to keep the crown, though who wouldn't, but because she believes in her marriage, in her daughter's legitimacy, in the sanctity of a sacrament. And so the war begins, but not the kind with swords and flaming arrows. No, this one's fought with parchment, papal briefs, and uncomfortable silences at court dinners. Ambassadors exchange veiled insults. Bishops stall. Rome dithers, as popes are very good at doing. Historians still argue whether Pope Clement VII would have granted the annulment if he hadn't been, kidnapped by Charles Festus, Catherine's nephew. Cosy little web. While this unfolds, you wander the court's outer chambers, where the gossip is thicker than the mead. Servants know things before nobles do. Mistress Anne, they whisper, is often with the king. Not alone, of course, that would be indecent, but always close. Anne Boleyn, sister of Henry's former mistress, yes, really, is clever, confident, and just Protestant enough to smell like reform. Anne won't sleep with him. Not yet. She's not dumb. She's read the room, and the Bible, and she knows the only safe way forward is as queen. Not consort, not plaything. Crown or nothing. And Catherine digs in. She testifies in court, publicly. With the calm of a woman who knows her value, she kneels before Henry and reminds him that she was his lawful wife, never his brother's, that their bond was pure, that she's borne his child and loved him loyally. The entire room holds its breath. You do too. Henry doesn't meet her eyes. Eventually he breaks with Rome. This is the moment everything changes, not just for Catherine, but for England. The Church of England is born not out of divine epiphany, but out of one man's obsession with legacy and lust. Monasteries will burn later. Books will be banned. But here and now, it's about a woman in her 40s losing her crown because she couldn't give birth to a boy. You sit with her in her final years, banished to increasingly cold, increasingly distant castles. She's no longer queen, merely Dowager Princess of Wales, a cruel demotion back to her first title. Mary is forbidden to see her. Her jewels are gone, her rooms are bare. Still, she writes to Henry, always ending with the same sign-off, yours as ever. Historians still debate whether this was love, habit, or holy endurance. And when she dies in 1536, her heart is said to have been blackened, literally, at the autopsy. Poison? Symbolism? Hard to say. But you picture her now, wrapped in dignity and silence, buried alone while Henry cavorts in celebration. Anne is queen by then, but we'll get to her. For now, you pull the blanket closer. Catherine's chapter ends not with screaming but with scripture, not with vengeance but with velvet grace. And perhaps, somewhere in the long corridors of ghostly castles, she still kneels, still praying for a kingdom that barely remembers her. You linger in the shifting light between torches and dawn, following Henry's gaze as it turns from Catherine's pious silhouette to a glittering figure draped in French lace and ambition. Anne Boleyn does not glide into history. She marches in, high chin, sharp wit, and a wardrobe full of sleeves wide enough to double as parade flags. Anne is everything Catherine wasn't. Where Catherine was all obedience and incense, Anne is flirtation with teeth. She's not classically beautiful. Contemporaries mention a sixth fingernail and a bit of a neck mole because of course they do. But when Anne enters a room, no one notices what's missing. They notice her voice, her laugh, her eyes that never quite stop judging you. You follow her through the corridors of power, where every step she takes feels calculated. Anne grew up in the glittering courts of Burgundy and France, learning how words dance, how glances are loaded, and how power can wear pearls. She knows how to withhold affection, how to bait a king without ever quite giving him what he wants, and oh, how Henry wants. For 6 years, she makes him wait, and during those 6 years, she becomes the storm. Henry rewrites the country's entire religious identity, just to get a clear path to Anne's bed and England's throne. Imagine the ego and the fear wrapped in that decision. Catherine is exiled, the Pope is dismissed, and the monasteries start to eye their stone walls nervously. Anne finally gets her crown in 1533 after a secret wedding and a very public coronation. You can almost hear the gold-threaded processions, see the velvet swaying like tides as the people gather in London streets. Some cheer, some don't. Many whisper that the new queen smells like trouble, and then, the baby, not a son, a daughter. You hear the collective inhale of an entire dynasty, the disappointment in Henry's smile. But Elizabeth, the child Anne gives birth to, is strong, alert, and somehow already looking at the midwife like she'll one day sentence her to death. You cradle her in your imagination, wrapped in crimson swaddling, unaware of the throne she might one day seize. Anne is not deterred. She tries again, and again. She suffers miscarriages. Rumours start. Henry grows cold. The court, once full of her allies, starts sharpening its gossip into knives, and then there's Jane Seymour. You spot her at the edges of this section, always looking down, always modest. But the king is turning again, sniffing out new possibilities. Jane is demure, everything Anne is not. And Anne? Anne is slipping. Fast. Historians still argue whether Anne was framed for adultery, or whether her flirtatious style, her sharpness, simply made her a too easy scapegoat. She made enemies, powerful ones, and a queen who can't give you a son becomes very easy to replace when your next crush already owns a veil. Meanwhile, you stroll past the murals in Hampton Court, some half-painted with Anne's initials twisted into Henry's. The workers are quietly chiselling out the A's, smoothing the surfaces where once there was a carved love knot. Anne doesn't see it coming, or maybe she does, but thinks her charm can still sway fate. Spoiler? It doesn't. But wait, don't flinch just yet. That scene's for later. For now, you're watching Anne, still technically queen, pacing in her chambers, writing letters to ambassadors, trying to plan a future that's already being redacted in the background. And far away, Catherine of Aragon lies cold in her grave. You lie back. Let the torchlight flicker against your closed eyes. The wheel is turning faster now. And Anne? She's about to find out what happens when a queen falls out of favour in a court built on pageantry, faith, and a king's mood swings. You move now through the breathless hush of the Tower grounds just past dawn, where dew clings to stone and silence weighs heavier than armour. The birds don't dare sing yet. The sky is pale and milk-silver, like it's holding its breath too. Anne Boleyn is already awake. You drift beside her in the Queen's lodgings, which, let's be honest, are just a better decorated prison. Her once rich gowns are replaced with simple kirtles, her jewels confiscated, her allies vanished. Her eyes, red-rimmed but still sharp, scan the floorboards like they might crack open and give her one more chance to escape. Not long ago she was England's crowned queen. Now she's accused of adultery, incest and high treason. Bold charges, bold lies perhaps. Historians still argue whether her flirtatious banter and courtly charm were ever actual infidelities, or whether Henry's advisers, desperate for a clean political exit, stitched together a scandal so grand it would silence everyone else's suspicions. The evidence is theatrical. 5 men, including her own brother, arrested. Jousting companions, musicians, Gentlemen who dared to be in the wrong place at the wrong time with a woman the king no longer loved. You can picture the panic in their eyes, the way guards' boots echoed against marble as names were whispered, confessions extracted. Torture wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was just watching someone else being led away. And Anne? She refuses to crumble. She holds court inside her cell with almost royal poise. She jokes with her ladies. She writes letters to Henry, still calling him my sweet lord. You imagine her voice wobbling, then steeling itself mid-sentence. She's playing the long game even now, but the long game no longer wants to be played. The trial is swift, public, a spectacle. Henry doesn't attend. He's busy getting fitted for new wedding doublets. Anne walks in with grace, denies every charge, and still manages to tilt her chin higher than everyone else in the room. The court, stacked with men loyal to the king, finds her guilty in a record time. The sentence, death by burning or beheading. Henry, in a rare moment of mercy or image management, chooses the sword. Anne requests a French executioner, one with a reputation for swiftness and precision. Because if you're going to die, you might as well die without a mess. She rehearses her final words, she chooses her final dress, and, this part's real, she gives money to the executioner in advance. You sit with her the night before, the cold stone pressing against your back as she prays, sings hymns, and waits. The woman who changed the course of English religion is now reduced to her final hours, wrapped in linen, combing her hair one last time, and then morning comes. You follow her barefoot steps to the scaffold. She's calm. There's a soft breeze, lifting the edges of her veil. The crowd is already gathered, silent. Some are here to mourn, some to watch, some because it's the only entertainment this century offers before Netflix. She speaks with elegance. She praises Henry, still calls him a gracious king. She asks the crowd to pray for her. No bitterness, just poise. The executioner hides his sword behind his back to avoid spooking her. She kneels, tucks in her skirt so she won't fall awkwardly, and waits. One stroke, no scream. Just the soft thud of a queen no longer welcome. You retreat as the crowd exhales. Blood seeps into the straw. Somewhere a raven croaks. Back at court, Henry is already planning his next wedding to Jane Seymour. The man wastes no time, and Anne's memory, once carved into every Tudor ceiling, starts being erased faster than you can whisper, "Be careful who you flirt with." But her daughter, Elizabeth. You glance back at the chapel. That daughter will one day rule England longer than any of them. But for now, she's just a baby, unaware that her mother's head lies feet away from the crown she died wearing. You step into a quieter kind of aftermath now, where ambition has fallen silent and the air smells of fresh white linen and recently sanded wood. Gone are the fiery glances and courtly intrigues. In their place, a softer hush, a steadier breath, a queen who speaks in soothing tones and never raises her voice, not even when the man beside her is a human thunderstorm in royal tights. Her name is Jane Seymour. Yes, we're on to wife number 3. And compared to the fireworks that came before, Jane is a lullaby. You find her sitting beside an embroidery hoop, fingers gently threading designs into fabric. Roses, vines, tiny swaddled infants. Henry notices this quiet grace. It helps that Jane is the exact opposite of Anne Boleyn in every imaginable way. She's pale, polite, and never contradicts him. Like, ever. Jane doesn't push for power. She doesn't provoke. Instead, she waits for Henry to come to her, arms open, voice calm, spine, possibly, made of tungsten. Because while Jane appears meek, don't be fooled, this woman plays a longer, subtler game, and she wins it. Just 10 days after Anne Boleyn's execution, Jane and Henry are betrothed. You can almost hear the court gasping behind their fans. The rush is indecent. But Henry needs a son, and Jane is, well, untainted, politically convenient and already fitted for wedding veils. Their marriage is short but not without drama. Jane works quietly to mend bridges within the family, most notably between Henry and his daughter Mary, Catherine of Aragon's child. That's no small feat, considering Mary's been declared illegitimate and is probably still clutching a rosary carved from pure indignation. Jane persuades Henry to reconcile, or at least to partially unclench. Historians still argue whether she did it from kindness, strategy, or a bit of both. Regardless, it works. Mary is cautiously welcomed back to court, though she remains very aware of how temporary approval in Tudor England can be. And then, Jane becomes pregnant. You can almost feel the collective exhale of the kingdom. This time, there's hope. Real hope. The court decorates for weeks. Musicians compose lullabies before the baby even arrives. Henry walks with a swagger so wide it could eclipse the sun. Jane retreats into her rooms for confinement, as was the custom, and the palace falls into that odd mix of anticipation and fear that only childbirth in the 16th century can summon. No epidurals, no sterilised instruments, just midwives, superstition, and prayers said in 3 languages. The child is born. A boy, Edward. And for the first time in his reign, Henry gets what he wants most, a legitimate male heir. You'd think the kingdom would erupt into celebration, and it does, but it's subdued by what happens next. Jane falls ill. Maybe it's puerperal fever, maybe it's exhaustion. Hygiene wasn't exactly England's strong suit at the time. Historians still debate the exact cause, but within 12 days of giving birth, Jane is dead. Henry is shattered. He wears black for months, unusual for a man who once scheduled banquets between beheadings. He mourns Jane more deeply, more publicly, than any of his other wives. He has her buried beside him at Windsor Castle, the only one to be granted that honour. You linger in her quiet legacy. No scandals, no treason, just peace, and a son who, unfortunately, will be too sickly to hold the throne for long. But that's a chapter for another time. For now, you see Jane's pale hands folded in eternal rest, her name etched into the silence between wars. She gave the king what he wanted most, and it cost her everything. And as Henry dons his mourning cloak, the wheels of royal matchmaking begin turning once again. You sigh, because you know what's coming. There's always another wedding. You re-enter the halls of Whitehall with a draught under your cloak and the unmistakable scent of ink, wax seals, and something between desperation and diplomatic perfume. Jane Seymour is barely in her tomb before Henry's advisers, ever the helpful opportunists, begin unfurling scrolls and family trees like medieval Tinder profiles. The king is in mourning, yes, but he's also the monarch of a still precarious dynasty. And a single heir, even a male one, is not a guarantee. Edward is a baby, and babies, well, let's just say infant mortality statistics in Tudor England wouldn't make it past HR today. And so, the matchmaking resumes. You trail behind the scribes as they pen letters to foreign courts, hunting for a 4th queen who ticks all the usual boxes: noble blood, fertile womb, docile personality, and, ideally, not inclined toward decapitation. This isn't just marriage anymore, it's foreign policy dressed in a bridal gown. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and political architect of the Reformation, suggests a German alliance, Protestant, strategic, safe-ish. He's got a candidate in mind, Anne of Cleves, sister to the Duke of Cleves. The alliance would strengthen England against Catholic enemies, and Anne, by all diplomatic accounts, is charming, humble, and fine-looking. Portraits are commissioned. Cue Hans Holbein, painter to the stars. He travels to Cleves and paints Anne in her best pose. Simple gown, demure smile, nothing too flashy, just enough to suggest she'd look good in Tudor green. You peer over his shoulder. It's a solid painting, maybe even a little flattering, and that's the problem, because Henry falls for the portrait. Like, hard. You walk beside him as he gazes at it, muttering things like sweet countenance and modest beauty, his expectations rising faster than England's inflation rate. When Anne finally arrives in England, the king can barely contain his excitement. He plans a surprise meet-cute, as if he's starring in a poorly written Renaissance rom-com. Unfortunately, Anne does not read the room. She doesn't recognise Henry, dressed incognito, and fails to swoon. Worse, he's instantly disappointed. She looks different. Not ugly, exactly, but not the sultry goddess he expected. "I like her not," he whispers later. That's direct quote. Henry isn't subtle. You want to take him aside and whisper, "It's not her, it's your unrealistic expectations and emotional immaturity." But alas, you're only an invisible bedtime companion. Still, the wedding goes ahead. Sort of. The ceremony is awkward. The The court pretends not to notice. Anne is confused. Henry is grumpy. And that night, that infamous wedding night, he tells Cromwell he can't do the deed. Claims Anne's body is unappealing, her breath unpleasant, her figure too unfamiliar. Historians still argue whether Henry's aversion was political, psychological, or physiological. Maybe he just panicked. Maybe he had performance issues. Maybe he didn't like her cleavage. Yes, he mentioned that, because of course he did. The marriage remains unconsummated. Within 6 months, Henry seeks a way out. Anne, to her immense credit, handles it like a pro. When told the king wants an annulment, she agrees. No protest, no fight, no tragic monologues, just grace, strategy, and a well-negotiated settlement. She's given a generous income, several estates, and the honorary title of the king's sister. Which sounds weird, but means she gets invited to Christmas dinners without fear of being poisoned. You find her afterward, sipping wine in a sunlit manor, playing cards with courtiers who find her oddly delightful. She survives Henry. She survives all his wives. She dies peacefully, decades later, in her own bed. Imagine that. So here lies Anne of Cleves, not in a tomb, but in your memory as the only wife who walked away richer, wiser, and intact. And Henry, he's already courting the next one. Because love, in the Tudor court, is really just a very expensive hat that no one wants to wear twice. Now, you wander into the strange, candlelit quiet between storm fronts. Anne of Cleves is settled into her new estate, probably breathing a sigh of relief into her embroidered pillowcase. The court barely has time to fold up the annulment paperwork before Henry is on the move again, heart bruised, pride limping, but still very much interested in wife number 5. Enter Catherine Howard. She's young, so young. Somewhere between 15 and 19, depending on which dusty parish register you believe. And while Henry is now over 40, gouty and shaped increasingly like a tipped wine barrel, he is once again convinced he's in love. You spot her at court, a blur of silk and rosewater perfume, laughing behind her hand, eyes darting just long enough to be noticed but not scolded. She's Anne Boleyn's cousin, which feels like a bad omen wrapped in velvet. But the king isn't thinking about family trees. He's thinking about youth, fertility, excitement, and quite possibly a midlife crisis the size of France. Catherine is everything Anne of Cleves was not. Flirtatious, physical, and eager to please. The court notices immediately. So does the king. He starts appearing in brighter fabrics. The tailors groan quietly. He arranges feasts, masks, and dances. She beams beside him, the new centre of gravity at court. To Henry she smells like second chances and lavender oil. To everyone else she smells like danger. Catherine Howard becomes queen in 1540. The wedding is lavish, if a little rushed. Henry calls her his rose without a thorn, a phrase that will age about as well as cod in summer. You're watching from the shadowed edges, sipping your invisible wine, seeing the smile stretched a little too tight. At first everything seems blissful, if you squint. Henry is delighted. Catherine is pampered. The court pretends not to notice the age gap, the awkward silences, or the way Catherine still sneaks glances at the younger men in the corridor. Because here's the truth. Catherine has a past. A complicated, breathless, candlelit past involving secret letters, stolen kisses, and at least one music teacher who really should have known better. Historians still argue how much Catherine understood about her own situation. Was she a flirtatious teenager in over her head? A victim of courtly predators? Or a cunning climber who knew how to make herself indispensable? You walk alongside her, watching as she navigates a court that is both a stage and a minefield. And then, the past comes knocking. A man named Francis Derham, part of Catherine's earlier escapades, shows up again, boastful, embittered, and just the wrong kind of chatty. He spreads stories. Whispers reach ears they shouldn't. And soon enough the king's council is snooping. Worse still, someone discovers a current affair. Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's chamber. Handsome, charming, and dangerously close to the queen. You can almost hear the ticking. Catherine's world begins to narrow. Her letters are examined, her past lovers arrested, interrogations begin, rooms grow colder, servants vanish, and then Henry finds out. This time, the hurt is different. He doesn't shout. He doesn't storm. He he goes silent, for days. You wander through Whitehall, the tapestries muffling the echoes of guards removing tapes, painting over crests, pulling up anything embroidered with a C and a heart. Catherine is moved to Sion Abbey, alone, afraid, and quickly unravelling. This chapter ends not in fire, but in frost. The Queen's music has stopped, the court is quiet, and somewhere deep within the stone bowels of the tower, a scaffold waits in the morning mist. But that's for next time. For now, you watch the young Queen whisper apologies into the cold wind. Because the past, it turns out, has a better memory than the King. Now you step softly into a scene lit by grief and protocol, like a candle flickering beside a guillotine. Catherine Howard is still technically Queen, but only because the paperwork hasn't caught up to the heartbreak. The court is in suspended animation. No feasts, no dancing, no music, just whispers, tense glances, letters burned in fireplaces by nervous hands. You hear boots clicking on stone corridors as messengers carry bad news wrapped in velvet ribbons. The royal crest still hangs above the Queen's chambers, but her name is being peeled from the tapestries stitch by stitch. You drift beside her now, not in her gilded rooms, but in the grey echo of Sion Abbey where she's been confined. It's cold. Her dresses are simpler. Her eyes, wide and frantic, search every servant's face for mercy. None comes. Catherine's past has already been confessed for her, and her present, well, that's under interrogation too. The investigation rolls on like a cruel parade. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper are arrested, interrogated, and, how to put this gently, not invited to a pleasant conversation over mead. One is tortured. The other, perhaps spared physically, confesses in writing. The letters Catherine wrote to Culpeper are found. One of them ends with, "Yours as long as life endures." It reads like a love note, but in Tudor England it might as well be a warrant. Henry's reaction? He crumbles. You don't see the rage this time. You see something worse. Wounded vanity. He hides from court, refuses meals. For a man who once danced daily and wolfed down swan pie, this is as dramatic as it gets. The rose without a thorn has pricked his pride and left him bleeding emotionally and politically. Still, pride must be defended. The Privy Council declares Catherine guilty. Parliament passes a new act making it treason for a queen to conceal her sexual history before marrying the king. Retroactive law, invented just for her. That's how scared they are. You walk with her down the Tower corridor now. It's February 1542. The morning is clear, cruelly beautiful. The guards keep their eyes down. Catherine walks to the scaffold in a simple gown, head high, lips whispering prayers she learned in childhood. They say she asked for the block the night before just to practice how to lay her head. They say she said, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Historians still argue whether that line is real or invented by someone who really likes dramatic irony. She's beheaded in one clean stroke. Beside her, the body of Jane Boleyn, her lady-in-waiting and Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law follows. Jane's role in this drama is a twisted one marked by testimonies, contradictions, and possible revenge. But on this day, her fate is sealed the same way. You step back from the scaffold. The crowd exhales again. It's almost a routine now. Henry retreats further into seclusion. You follow him as he walks alone through empty banquet halls, the music long since stopped, portraits of wives past lining the walls with eyes that don't blink. 3 queens dead, 2 divorced, 1 son to show for it. But still, the crown needs a queen. England needs stability. And Henry, well, Henry needs someone who knows how to manage a man who's run out of illusions and inches closer to death with each passing year. The matchmaking resumes, but the tone has changed. The next wife won't be chosen for lust, or alliances, or portraits. This time, Henry needs a nurse more than a bride, and waiting in the wings is a woman who's read the entire Bible, kept her head down, and learned exactly when to speak, and when to smile. You step now into a quieter chapter, one that smells of herbal poultices and pressed linen, where the fire crackles more from necessity than comfort. Henry VIII is older. Not old, not by Tudor standards, but aging in royal dog years. The years of jousting, feasting, and stomping around like a hormonal warhorse have caught up with him. His leg, once the pride of his armour, is now a festering wound, an ulcer that refuses to heal, oozing beneath layers of velvet and pride. His waistline is formidable, his temper worse. He doesn't dance anymore. And beneath all the ermine and gold thread there is a very lonely man with a crown that weighs heavier each night. Enter Catherine Parr. No, not Howard. This is the sixth and final queen. And unlike the last two, she's not here to dazzle or flirt. She's here to survive. You find her in the quieter corners of court, reading scripture by candlelight, helping her stepchildren with Latin, and answering questions like, "Would you consider marrying a man who's buried half his wives?" Spoiler, she says yes. Catherine Parr is already twice widowed. She's intelligent, devout, politically cautious, and, importantly, experienced in dealing with cranky older men. Historians still debate whether she loved Henry or simply understood him. Like someone who's learned to soothe a lion with a cup of chamomile tea, you watch their courtship unfold in an almost painfully dignified fashion. No wild declarations, no lute serenades, just quiet meetings, shared scripture, and mutual utility. Henry needs a companion. Catherine sees an opportunity, not for power, but for influence. Reformers recognise her as an ally. The conservative faction, less thrilled. They marry in 1543. Catherine becomes queen, yes, but also nurse, secretary, and moral compass. She tends to Henry's ulcers. She calms his outbursts. She writes religious texts under her own name, the first English queen to publish a book. You see her pen moving across the parchment, steady, serene, knowing that every word will be examined for heresy. Because yes, Catherine Parr is a Protestant sympathiser in a Catholic-leaning court, and that, dangerous, especially when Henry's moods are as stable as a Tudor feast table on a dirt road. Still, she plays it brilliantly. She encourages education. She protects Princess Elizabeth and Prince Edward. She works quietly to reconcile Mary again. Yes, that Mary, still clinging to rosaries and memories. Catherine somehow becomes a maternal figure to all three of Henry's children. And Henry, he's calmer. Not happy exactly, but less monstrous, less erratic. With Catherine beside him, he writes fewer death warrants. He even lets her take control of the Regency Council during one of his campaigns, an unheard of show of trust. You imagine her walking those echoing corridors, making decisions with one hand and wiping ink off her gown with the other. But danger is never far. At one point, the conservative faction digs up enough of her Protestant writings to accuse her of heresy. They draft a warrant. They plan an arrest. You feel the breath catch in her throat as she's warned, just in time by one of her ladies. What does Catherine do? She kneels before Henry, confesses her errors, claims she only argued theology to distract him from his pain. Brilliant. Submissive on the surface, strategic beneath it. The warrant is dropped. The accusers scolded. The Queen saved by her wits. And yet again she survives. You picture her now, walking slowly beside the king's wheeled litter. He's nearly immobile. His robes have been expanded. His crown no longer sits straight. But Catherine remains, gentle, steady. A calming presence in a reign that has devoured 5 wives before her. She doesn't give him a child, but she gives him peace. And in Henry's final days, that may be the most miraculous gift of all. The candlelight dims as you drift deeper into this long, unravelling tapestry. Henry is fading, slowly, heavily, like a cathedral collapsing in slow motion. His courtiers tiptoe around his moods. His physicians whisper about drainage and decay. His enemies for now hold their tongues because the king still has teeth. But not for long, and by his side, still writing, still listening, is Catherine Parr. By now, you've come to understand she's more than just a survivor. She's a chess player in a palace full of checkers. While others plotted, she studied. While others charmed, she endured. Her mind is sharper than Henry's blade ever was. You sit with her by the fire. She's reviewing one of her religious manuscripts, Lamentations of a Sinner. It's bold, filled with ideas about grace, faith, scripture, ideas that would have gotten someone else burned 5 years earlier, but Catherine frames them with care. Her theology is personal, not political, or at least she makes it seem that way. Historians still argue how much she pushed the Protestant agenda behind the scenes. Was she actively reforming England, or merely protecting those who did? Did she hold the pen, or simply hand over the ink? You'll never know. But the fact that you're still wondering means she played it just right. Meanwhile, Henry is disintegrating. Physically, spiritually, literally. His leg ulcer won't heal. His once mighty frame is now dragged around on a reinforced wheeled chair. The courtiers still call him Your Majesty, but their eyes flick away. The throne is losing its shine, the crown, its certainty. And yet, in those final months, Henry writes a will. He names Edward, Jane Seymour's son, as heir. But Edward is only 9. So Henry assembles a regency council of 16 noblemen to guide the boy king. Notably, Catherine is not included, even after everything. After surviving plots, firestorms, religious battles, and 5 other queens' worth of cautionary tales, Catherine Parr is sidelined in the final royal shuffle, perhaps because she's a woman, perhaps because she's too clever, perhaps because Henry knew she'd outmaneuver the lot of them. But she remains dignified. You find her reading to Henry on cold evenings, even as his mind wanders. You hear her correcting servants gently when they mumble titles incorrectly. You watch her stroke his hand when the pain gets bad, quiet gestures that leave no inscription, no statue, no heraldry, but are more human than any of the rest. Then one day, quite simply, Henry stops breathing. He dies in January 1547, surrounded by formality, wrapped in robes, whispered prayers. It is not a noble death. There's a fire lit to mask the smell of infection. And the court, ever prepared, begins removing tapestries and packing trunks before the body cools. Catherine Parr, she doesn't weep in public, she doesn't faint, she withdraws, quietly, carefully. A woman who walked a tightrope over a sea of axes for nearly 5 years has finally stepped off, and she's still alive. Henry is buried beside Jane Seymour, the one he claimed to love most, though she barely lived long enough to disappoint him. Catherine receives no grand send-off, no poetic farewell. She's simply done. Or so you'd think. But remember, she's only in her 30s, and there's still a bit of Tudor drama left for her to navigate. This story may have started with Henry, but Catherine Parr, she's not finished yet. You return now to a changed England, one that's adjusting cautiously to life after Henry VIII. The thrones are still polished, the courtiers still suspiciously polite, but the man who once roared orders from behind a mountain of brocade is now 6 feet under, entombed beside Jane Seymour in a chapel, thick with the scent of incense and succession anxiety. And yet amid all this reshuffling, Catherine Parr does something unexpected. She marries for love. Yes, really, love. Not politics, not duty, not convenience, not even theology. Just affection, connection. Someone who wrote her letters while she was still married to the most dangerous widower in English history. And no, he didn't wait long. His name is Thomas Seymour, brother to Jane Seymour, uncle to the new boy, King Edward VI, and ambitious enough to wear a crown if it weren't, reserved for someone else. Tall, handsome, and a little too charming for his own good, Thomas has been circling Catherine for years like a very well-dressed falcon. When Henry dies, they don't wait long. Within months, they're secretly wed. So secretly, in fact, that the Regency Council frowns upon it. There are whispers of indecency, impatience, opportunism. But you're watching Catherine smile again. Maybe for the first time in years, not the careful court smile, a real one. She moves into Chelsea Manor, a quieter place by the river, where gardens bloom and the Thames laps gently at stone steps. She surrounds herself with books, reformers, ladies-in-waiting, and Princess Elizabeth. Yes, that Elizabeth. The future Gloriana is about 13 now, clever beyond her years, already fluent in 4 languages, and very aware that every room she enters measures her as either threat or asset. Catherine becomes her guardian, her mentor, her protector. You see them walking in the gardens together, Catherine correcting Elizabeth's Greek grammar, Elizabeth pausing to ask sharp questions about Parliament. There's respect between them, affection even, though it's strained later by the man in the house, Thomas Seymour. Thomas, it turns out, is not as clever as he thinks. He flirts, he intrudes. He enters Elizabeth's room too early, too often. Catherine reportedly laughs it off at first, tries to manage the situation, even joins in the roughhousing to defuse the discomfort. But the whispers grow. Elizabeth is eventually sent away for her own safety and probably Catherine's sanity. Historians still debate what exactly happened between Thomas and Elizabeth. Was it innocent? Was it grooming? Did Elizabeth understand the danger? Did Catherine? The records blur, as records often do when powerful men behave poorly and clever women are forced to adapt. But then, something extraordinary. Catherine becomes pregnant. At 36, after years of avoiding childbirth, and after marrying a man who treats impulse like strategy, Catherine is finally expecting a child. There's joy, yes, but also fear. Late pregnancies in the 16th century are risky, and Catherine knows it. You sit beside her during the summer of 1548 as the manor fills with sunlight, flowers and preparations. She writes letters, she arranges baptisms, she talks about hope, about legacy. You want to believe this will end gently, but it won't. She gives birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour, and within 6 days Catherine falls ill. The fever comes fast. Her mind unravels. She begins to accuse those around her, especially Thomas, of betrayal. Her final days are filled with pain, confusion and sorrow. Her words, once so measured, become fragmented. She dies in September 1548, just over a year after Henry. And this time there's no royal mourning, no trumpets, no black-draped balconies, just a quiet funeral at Sudeley Castle, her coffin placed in a chapel that still stands today. The inscription calls her a queen, rightfully. You pause by her grave, the only one of Henry's 6 wives to be buried alone, the only one who chose her final husband freely, and the only one who wrote the end of her story with her own hand, pen before sword, scripture before politics. Now you drift through the long corridors of memory, where the scent of rosemary and fading parchment lingers. Henry VIII may be gone, but his shadow stretches over England like a thundercloud that forgot to leave, and for all his wives, buried, banished, or barely remembered, there remains the haunting question: what did it all add up to? You find yourself walking past a stained glass window in some quiet chapel, sunlight catching the figures of queens long gone. 6 of them, each with a story, each with an ending, but their legacies, those live on, in fragments, in documents, in rumours too stubborn to die. Let's start with what Henry wanted most: sons. He got one, Edward VI, just Jane Seymour's child, and while he was smart and devout, Edward was sickly from the start. The boy coughed through council meetings and grew up surrounded by men who were more interested in their own power than his health. He ruled only 6 years before dying at 15, barely old enough to develop a beard, let alone shape an empire. You step softly through his short reign, where Catherine Parr's influence still lingers. Her reforms, her writings, they helped shape the religious identity of Edward's court: Protestant, stern, reformist. But her death left a gap no one could quite fill. And then there's Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter. You find her older now, regal and wary, finally sitting on the throne that had been denied to her for most of her life. Queen Mary, she tries to restore Catholicism, she marries Philip of Spain, she burns heretics. The people call her Bloody Mary, though historians still argue whether that's entirely fair or just very catchy Tudor branding. You sense in Mary the echoes of her mother's endurance, the iron will beneath the silk, but she rules in fear, with fire, and ultimately she dies without children, haunted by phantom pregnancies and real disappointment. And then Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the red-haired girl with eyes like cunning fire. She becomes queen in 1558. You watch her rise slowly, carefully from illegitimacy to supremacy. The woman who was nearly cast aside as an embarrassment becomes the Virgin Queen, the longest reigning Tudor monarch. Her rule is golden, glittering with victories and poetry and impossible self-control. Elizabeth never marries, never shares the throne. Historians still argue why. Was it fear of becoming her mother? Of losing power? Of trusting the wrong man? Whatever the reason, she remains a woman alone at the helm of an empire. And every time she walks into court in jewelled gowns and powdered glory, you can almost hear the rustle of all 6 wives behind her, stitched into her silence. But we're not done with legacies yet. You pause in Hampton Court, where tapestries still carry the initials H&A for Henry and Anne, because someone forgot to chisel them out. You pass by a chapel in Peterborough, where Catherine of Aragon lies with her motto, humble and loyal. You visit Sudeley Castle, where Catherine Parr rests alone, her book still on shelves somewhere. You walk through echoes, and the truth is, while Henry's face is on the coins and the portraits, The real legacy of his reign is written in women. Queens who ruled, suffered, endured, some beheaded, some erased, one survived. They weren't just footnotes, they were forces. The Tudor dynasty was held together by silk and scripture, wombs and whispers, letters and lies. You feel it now, don't you? The weight of their choices. The price of their proximity to a man who thought love meant ownership and power was just another name for desire. You rest now in a quiet cloister, warmed by the flickering memory of their lives. 6 women, 1 king, endless consequences, and far off a bell chimes, not for a coronation, not for a beheading, just for memory. You settle now into the after-hours of empire, where the fires burn lower and the voices of history grow softer, but not silent. While kings and queens may fade into the dust of painted portraits, some legacies continue by candlelight, and in Catherine Parr's case, with a quill. Yes, this chapter is hers again. Because while Henry's other wives were judged by their wombs, Catherine Parr left behind something that couldn't be burned, buried, or politically annulled: her books. You find her again in memory, seated beneath a window streaked with rain, her velvet shawl around her shoulders, her ink-stained fingers moving over pages with quiet confidence. She writes not just letters or prayers, but theology. Serious, controversial, risky theology, and she signs her name. No pseudonyms, no hiding behind courtiers. Her most famous work, Prayers or Meditations, was the first book published in English by a woman under her own name. Think about that. A Queen of England, widow of Henry VIII, stepping into the world of printed ideas where women were expected to remain merely subjects, not authors. And yet there she is. Lamentations of a Sinner goes even further. It's deeply personal, confessional. She writes of grace, redemption, and the need for direct access to Scripture. These are Protestant ideas, dangerous ones, but she packages them with such care, such humility, that even the most sceptical bishops hesitate to challenge her. You sit beside her now as she reviews galleys, corrects spelling, chooses dedication pages. She's not just editing text, she's editing the image of what a queen can be. And she's not alone in the shadows. In her literary circle are women like Anne Askew, burned at the stake for refusing to recant her Protestant beliefs. Catherine tried to protect her. She couldn't. But she remembers, and she writes for them both. Historians still debate how much political influence Catherine wielded through her books. Was she softening Henry's views on religion near the end? Was she guiding Princess Elizabeth's thinking? Certainly her household was a hotbed of Reformation thinkers, scholars, translators, preachers, all circulating quietly through her drawing rooms like intellectual fireflies. It's not the kind of power that makes headlines in Tudor times, but it's the kind that lasts. You flip through the pages with her now. The parchment smells faintly of lavender and old ink. Her words are precise, calm, but there's steel beneath them. These are not just devotions, they're declarations. She believed women could read Scripture for themselves. She believed salvation was personal. She believed a queen could be both pious and political. And for all her strategic silences at court, her writing is fearless. You wander through her legacy even now. Every female writer who claimed a voice in the centuries that followed, Mary Sidney, Aphra Behn, Jane Austen, they all walked through doors Catherine helped crack open. You imagine her ghost not pacing palace halls like Anne or Catherine Howard, but instead seated quietly in a library that never closes, still writing, still whispering truth into centuries that haven't caught up yet. And while history often remembers queens for who they married, who they bore, or how they died, Catherine Parr reminds you there's another path: to rule through reason, to endure with dignity, to leave behind words that outlive thrones. You return now to the corridors of decline, where velvet still hangs, but the colours have faded, and the once furious echoes of courtly life have grown dull and slow. Henry VIII's reign is over, but he hasn't quite left the building. Not really. You find him in portraits, of course. Massive, wide-legged, one hand on a dagger, the other on a table, as if to say, "This room belongs to me." But it's all a painting now. You know the truth behind the image, the pain, the rot, the exhaustion of a man who turned wives into political weapons and ended up with more funerals than heirs. This is the Henry of final years, and you're walking with him slowly, very slowly through his last rooms. He can barely move. The ulcer in his leg never healed, and by now the stench of infection is so strong that servants pretend they can't smell it. His appetite remains enormous, but his ability to digest both food and politics has withered. Still, no one dares mention it. He's the king. Even when he drools during meetings, even when he forgets who sent which ambassador where, no one corrects him. You can feel the discomfort around him. It's not fear anymore, it's fatigue. His counsellors shuffle through decisions. His children, Mary, Elizabeth, Edward, circle like moons around a planet whose gravity is failing. And Henry? He signs documents with a shaky hand. He mumbles Latin phrases in his sleep. He talks to the ghosts of women he once loved or claimed to. Maybe Catherine of Aragon appears in his dreams, still proud, still praying. Maybe Anne Boleyn stands there silently, holding her head in her hands, not quite accusing him, but not forgiving him either. Maybe he never really let go of Jane Seymour. Historians still debate whether he ever felt true remorse. He had moments, softened glances, old letters tucked into drawers. But did he ever fully reckon with what he'd done? Probably not. Power numbs accountability. Still, the evidence is there, in his isolation, in the fact that he doesn't take another wife after Catherine Parr. The man who once changed religion to escape a marriage now ends his days too tired to flirt, too broken to chase. You imagine his final audience, nobles standing in silence, candles guttering against the cold stone. Henry propped on a cushion, voice barely audible. One hand gripping the chair's edge as if afraid the throne itself might disappear beneath him. He dies in January 1547, not with a bang, not with court fanfare, but in his sleep surrounded by whispers and the flutter of servants already making plans for the next regime. He's buried next to Jane Seymour, per his wishes, in St. George's Chapel. A simple vault, no grand mausoleum, no parade of queens in mourning, just stone and shadow. And maybe that's fitting. Because in the end, Henry VIII, the man who redefined kingship, split the church, and married 6 women in pursuit of a dream, died alone, with only one heir who survived him, a son too young, a legacy too tangled, and a crown waiting for its next victim. You linger at the edge of the chapel now. The air is still, the candles flicker, and far off, beyond the pews, you think you hear the rustle of silk skirts, the sigh of a woman's voice not quite ready to forgive. But the king is gone. You find yourself walking through the echo of a crown now, its weight still real, but no longer attached to the roaring giant who once wore it. Henry VIII is gone, but his absence feels strangely louder than his presence ever did. It presses down on the court like a velvet-draped thundercloud. You pass through corridors where paintings have already been rehung. Old advisors shuffle in new patterns. The servants don't mention him unless they have to, but you can still feel it. That lingering question, what now? The boy king, Edward VI, is crowned. Just 9 years old, he looks like a porcelain version of his father, fragile, painted, posed too carefully. You hover near the coronation, watching a too small crown being balanced on a too small head, while a group of ambitious uncles and reformers circle like falcons. His reign is Protestant, cautious, precocious, and over far too quickly. Edward dies in 1553, tuberculosis most likely, the kind that creeps in quietly, then devours everything, and then everything lurches. In his will, Edward names Lady Jane Grey, his cousin, and a committed Protestant as heir. But Lady Jane lasts 9 days on the throne. 9 days. The poor girl didn't even want the crown. You picture her squinting at legal documents, wondering how her life became a footnote before it had time to be a story. The people rise for Mary. Yes, that Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, now fully grown, fully Catholic, and fully determined to set England back on what she calls the right path. Her reign begins with hope but ends in smoke. Literally, you see the bonfires, the executions, the burnings at Smithfield, Protestants, reformers, men and women dragged out and given the cruelest invitation, recant or roast. Bloody Mary, they call her, though to be fair, her father executed way more people. But she has no son, no legacy but fear, and then Mary dies. She leaves no heir, no child, just the scent of scorched parchment and Spanish disappointment. The crown passes once again to a daughter born of a queen who died by sword, Elizabeth. You return to court as she enters, resplendent, poised, her face powdered, her mind razor-sharp. Elizabeth I becomes everything her father never expected from a daughter. She reigns for 44 years, outlasting every man who tried to control her. She never marries. She signs death warrants with a steady hand. She speaks 7 languages, navigates plots, defeats the Spanish Armada, and turns her father's muddled legacy into a golden age. But even her court is haunted. You hear it in her speeches, whispers of her mother, Anne Boleyn. You see it in her refusal to marry, her distance, her wary dance with Parliament. She was raised knowing how fast love can become a blade. And the other wives. Catherine of Aragon's devotion lives in Mary's stubborn faith. Anne Boleyn's intelligence pulses in Elizabeth's political brilliance. Jane Seymour's son was king briefly. Anne of Cleves lives out her years in comfort, the quiet survivor. Catherine Howard's ghost lingers in youthful tragedy, and Catherine Parr, well, her books are still read. Her influence still murmurs through theological debates. She raised the children who ruled. Each wife left a mark, even if history tries to reduce them to how they exited the throne. Divorced, beheaded, died. You pass through palaces where their portraits still hang, their eyes, all of them watching. And you wonder, what if it had gone differently? What if Anne had given birth to a healthy son? What if Catherine Howard had stayed hidden? What if Catherine Parr had ruled in her own name? You don't get answers, but the questions stay with you, tucked into the stone walls of castles and the silences of council chambers. 6 wives, 1 dynasty, a kingdom forever shaped by the women who dared to marry a man no one could fully love without risking everything. You find yourself in the quieter corners of court now, where the gossip lingers long after the music fades. The great events are over, the beheadings, the births, the bannings, but there's another kind of history still churning, the whispered kind, the garden bench history, the embroidery circle speculations, the did you hear what she really said moments. Welcome to the Tudor rumour mill. You sit now with the ladies in waiting, the scribes, the diplomats' wives, and the seamstresses who stitched secrets into bodices. These are the people who watched the queens up close, who knew which foot creaked on which stair, who could interpret a sigh from across the room, and they have thoughts. Lots of them. Let's start with Anne Boleyn, because let's be honest, the gossip about her never stopped. Was she actually guilty of adultery? Or was it all just a carefully orchestrated takedown by Cromwell and other conservative nobles threatened by her influence? You sip your imaginary mead as the stories swirl. She had 6 fingers, you know, someone whispers. She bewitched the king with her eyes. She told Jane Seymour she'd die the same way she did. That one's not true, by the way, but it was great court drama. And Catherine of Aragon? She's remembered with reverence by some and irritation by others. To her Spanish supporters she was a saint, stoic, faithful, noble. To her critics she was stubborn, political, and just a little too proud. Some courtiers insist she wore the same robe every Friday to mourn her lost title. Others say she never cried once. Jane Seymour, meanwhile, remains a mystery to many. Was she genuinely gentle? Or was that the mask of a shrewd player who saw an opening after Anne's downfall and seized it? She was the quietest, one voice murmurs. The deadliest, another adds. Anne of Cleves is remembered fondly. She laughed when Henry divorced her, says a laundress, said she'd rather have her head than his bed. Probably apocryphal, definitely delightful. Catherine Howard, young and tragic, is gossiped about in mournful tones. She thought love could protect her, someone sighs. She should have known better. They talk of her giggles, her dances, her letters passed under doorways. You picture a girl too young for the game, and too trusting of players with knives up their sleeves. And Catherine Parr? The ladies mostly respect her, but some say she was cold, calculated. Too clever, one matron sniffs. A woman shouldn't correct her husband's Latin. You raise an eyebrow at that. She survived Henry. She published books. She raised 3 royal children. Sounds pretty warm-blooded to you. Historians still argue what the women of the court truly thought. Diaries are rare, letters are filtered, but the stories passed mouth to mouth. They paint a different history. A history full of snubbed glances, shared handkerchiefs, knowing smiles. One where queens weren't just symbols, but women. Clever, scared, brave, tired, strategic, and real. You lean back now, listening as the wind carries these half-truths and full-bodied rumours across the palace garden. A servant says she saw Elizabeth Boleyn weeping into a curtain the day her daughter was arrested. A nurse says Jane Seymour once confessed she was terrified of childbirth. Someone else swears Catherine Parr and Elizabeth once shared a coded journal. Most of it can't be proven, but that's not really the point, because gossip is how people made sense of kings too powerful to question and queens too closely watched to speak freely. It's where truth, fiction, and survival met for tea and quietly judged each other. And as you rise to leave this invisible circle, the voices trail behind you, low, melodic, always curious. The queens are gone, but the stories, still talking. Now you step through a doorway not of stone but of splendour, into the closets and coffers of queens long gone. This chapter smells like cedarwood, ambergris, and the faint perfume of political symbolism woven directly into silk. Because if you really want to understand Henry's wives, you have to open their wardrobes. Yes, we're going inside the royal closet. Don't worry, it's not dusty. This is no storage room. It's a gallery of self-presentation, a chessboard of hems and headdresses where every thread has meaning and every jewel a message. Start with Catherine of Aragon. She's your anchor in crimson and gold, Spanish velvet stitched with pomegranate motifs, a nod to her family crest. Her sleeves are structured, her skirts modest, and her jewellery. Always tasteful, always devout. Her signature look was as much armour as aesthetic. A quietly whispered, "I am the true queen." Even when Henry moved on, she never dressed down. Her dignity remained sewn into every fold. Anne Boleyn? Oh, she changed the game entirely. French hoods, tighter bodices, dark silks that made her skin glow like a candle. She didn't just wear fashion, she weaponized it. That famous bee necklace. It wasn't just an accessory, it was a challenge. I am here. I belong. I don't care if you don't like it. She brought continental elegance to an insular court and made it impossible for anyone to look away. Jane Seymour pulled the pendulum back. She dressed conservatively. White and grey, Tudor roses embroidered low and subtle. Nothing flashy. She knew the court was still bruised from Anne. Her fashion said, "I'm safe. I won't cause trouble. Please don't start sharpening anything yet." Anne of Cleves? Practical. Her German style baffled the English court. Square necklines, layered gowns, long sleeves with almost architectural structure. Henry claimed he found her unfashionable, but you suspect the issue had less to do with fabric and more with expectation. She was dressing for respect, not seduction. Smart woman. Then comes Catherine Howard, trailing rose-pink satin, ribbons, pearls sewn in patterns shaped like hearts. Her gowns were youthful, sometimes too youthful, shorter sleeves, lighter colours. Her hair was often worn long, scandalously free. It made people talk, but she knew how to make a room stop when she entered. It just didn't save her. And Catherine Parr, she was elegance redefined. Deep blues, silver embroidery, books tucked under her arm like other women carried fans. Her fashion was regal but intellectual, understated but expensive. You picture her stepping into a chamber, all eyes on her fur trim while she quotes a psalm. She balanced the court's expectations like a seasoned tightrope walker, and always landed on her feet. But clothes were only the beginning. Their jewels spoke volumes, rings engraved with secret mottos, lockets hiding miniature portraits, brooches shaped like anchors, flames, or Tudor roses, symbols whispered into gold and pinned above the heart. Their accessories were coded messages: loyalty, fertility, favour, faith. Even the stitching of their petticoats sometimes contained phrases, Latin prayers, Protestant verses, hidden beneath the layers, just in case someone looked too closely. And then there's hair. Yes, hair mattered. Catherine of Aragon's auburn braids, always tightly bound. Anne's dark tresses, curled to distraction. Jane's modestly veiled buns. Catherine Howard's youthful waves. Elizabeth, years later, will inherit all of it. Those choices, those signals, and wrap herself in wigs so elaborate they deserve their own throne. Historians still debate whether these fashion choices were fully autonomous or managed by male courtiers. But we know this. Every hemline, every pearl, every choice of French hood versus English gable cap meant something. In a world where women had no official power, appearance was influence, style was strategy, wardrobes were weapons. So next time you look at a Tudor portrait and think, nice dress, remember, you're seeing a survival strategy, a manifesto, and a battle cry. And in the echoing closets of history, the gowns still hang, waiting. Now you slip into the folds of history not as it happened, but as it might have. The air here feels different, as if time has taken a deep breath and asked, what if? This is the territory of alternate paths, sliding doors, and soft speculation. Tonight, you walk through a timeline built on a single, astonishing possibility. What if Anne Boleyn had given Henry a healthy son? Just imagine. It's 1533. The bells ring not just for Anne's coronation, but for the triumphant arrival of a baby boy. Let's call him Henry, like his father, because originality was never this dynasty's strong suit. The king is elated. Parliament cheers. The Catholic world grits its teeth. Anne's position is unshakable. She's no longer just the woman who changed the church. She's the mother of England's future. You see her walking through court with a new kind of authority, not the brittle, dazzling confidence of her real-life reign, but a smoother, sturdier version. Her enemies can't touch her now. She has what no one else could give Henry: security. Catherine of Aragon fades into history as a stubborn widow. Mary Tudor is quietly passed over in succession. Elizabeth? In this version, she's still born, perhaps in a later year, but she's not the heir. She's the spare, the smart one, the overlooked one. And what of Jane Seymour? She stays a lady-in-waiting, watching from the sidelines, her calm hands folding linens instead of holding royal infants. Her brother Edward never becomes the boy king. The Seymour name remains respectable, but not royal. Anne Boleyn, secure in her queenship, continues her reformist leanings. Protestant scholars visit. The English Bible is printed faster. She pushes Henry, carefully, toward more education for women. Maybe she and Catherine Parr exchange letters later, theologian to theologian, instead of ghost to ghost. But the ripple effects don't stop there. With a male heir from Anne, there's no rush to marry again. No parade of wives, no broken alliances, no Catherine Howard scandal, no burned Jane Grey, no half-dozen royal wedding rings locked away in some drawer. And maybe, just maybe, England avoids the bloody pendulum swings between Protestant and Catholic rule that defined the mid-16th century. Instead, you imagine Prince Henry growing into adulthood with his brilliant, sharp-tongued mother whispering in his ear and his famously grumpy father watching from a cushioned chair. When Henry VIII eventually dies, there's no scramble, no 9-day queens, no religious purges. Prince Henry ascends. Queen Anne retires in luxury, unbeheaded, unbanished, unbroken. And what of Elizabeth? She grows up without the trauma of her mother's execution. No illegitimacy, no need to harden herself into marble. Maybe she becomes a great advisor, a scholar, or, who knows, maybe she still rules. Maybe when her brother dies young, as Edward did in our world, the crown passes to her not with hesitation, but with celebration. But then again, maybe Anne's son becomes a tyrant. Maybe he's worse than his father, or weaker, or so reformist he burns down half the church. There are no guarantees. After all, this is Tudor England, where each decision is made with more emotion than foresight, and every heir is just a misstep away from becoming a ghost. Historians still argue whether a son would have truly secured Anne's safety. Henry was fickle, court factions brutal. One miscarriage and the whispers would return, but still, the thought lingers. A son, a kingdom transformed, a woman who never had to kneel at a scaffold. You step back now from the mist of that imagined past, the threads untangle, time snaps into place. The real world, with all its pain and poetry, returns. But in the quiet corners of memory, Anne Boleyn still holds a baby boy in her arms, and for a moment, the axe never falls. You walk now through the foggy edges of analysis, where facts start to fray and interpretations run wild. The 6 wives of Henry VIII are long gone, their bones at rest in stone crypts and shadowed chapels, but their stories very much alive. Tonight you eavesdrop on historians, biographers, playwrights and podcast hosts, some in dusty libraries, others in brightly lit studios with latte foam on their lips, all trying to answer one deceptively simple question: who were these women really? And the more you listen, the more complicated it gets. Let's start with the basic breakdown. Something students learn in schools, often in sing-song tones that frankly undersell the trauma. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. It's catchy, convenient, and wildly reductive. Were they just victims? Not quite. Take Catherine of Aragon. Some scholars argue she was stubborn to the point of sabotage. Others call her the model of queenship, resilient, educated, dignified. One paper even suggested she weaponized piety like a Tudor ninja. Her legacy, not just a scorned wife, but a political chess master who stood firm against an entire reformation. Anne Boleyn. Oh, she's the queen of debates. Was she a Protestant martyr? A manipulative flirt? A misunderstood genius? Some portray her as England's Eve, tempting Henry into ruin. Others see her as the first modern woman, intelligent, ambitious, undone by a court that couldn't stomach either. She's been everything from seductress to saint, depending on which bookshelf you reach for. Jane Seymour, silent enigma. Historians still debate whether she was truly meek or simply clever enough to play the long game. Was she Henry's favourite because she gave him a son, or because she died before she could disappoint him? Anne of Cleves gets high marks from modern analysts. The smart one, they say. The one who saw the axe coming and said, "No, thanks, I'll take the estate and the pension." She reappears in documentaries as the underrated queen who played Henry better than anyone. Catherine Howard, long painted as a foolish girl in over her head. But now more scholars call her a victim, of grooming, of power, of a system that valued youth more than safety. Her trial, once dismissed as cautionary, is now revisited as tragedy. And Catherine Parr, librarians love her, feminists too, a published author, a theological voice, a survivor in a world where queen often meant temporary. But was she emotionally close to Henry, or just his intellectual caretaker? Was she politically powerful, or simply lucky? Every historian brings their own lens. Some frame the wives as cautionary tales. Others see them as symbols of change, of feminine agency trying to bloom in a world built by men and governed by bloodlines. And still others focus on the way their stories have been retold and repackaged. On stage, in novels, in Netflix miniseries where corsets are optional, but emotional trauma is mandatory. You might have heard them sing in a certain pop musical recently, giving each queen a voice, a microphone, and a punchline. It's catchy, clever, and weirdly accurate. Because maybe the real tragedy isn't that they suffered, but that they were silenced for so long. Historians still argue over the facts. Which queen was the smartest, the most influential, the most wronged? And perhaps the better question is, why do we keep asking? Maybe because deep down we see ourselves in them. The resilience, the rebellion, the fear, the hope that love won't kill us and power won't corrupt us, and history might finally tell our story right. You sit quietly now with those questions, no sword, no crown. Just the soft rustle of pages turning and voices disagreeing in respectful tones. And maybe that's the most human thing about all of this, that we keep wondering. Because if history teaches anything, it's that truth wears many gowns and never goes out of style. You arrive now in the quietest halls of all, the ones that don't echo with feasts or verdicts or screams. These are the long galleries where time has slowed, where footsteps barely make a sound, and where the ghosts of England's queens, if they still linger, do so in silence. You are at Hampton Court. It's night. The torches are out. The tour groups are gone. And you're here, wandering the passages once walked by Catherine Howard and Anne Boleyn, your breath barely visible in the cold hush. The walls themselves seem to inhale and exhale, as though the palace remembers. And oh, it does. Hampton Court is a museum now, but it hasn't forgotten who it once was. Ask the right caretaker, and they'll tell you about the screaming lady. Catherine Howard, they say, still runs down the haunted gallery, where she once tried to reach Henry and beg for her life. You imagine her now, bare feet on the stone floor, night-dress twisted with panic, guards catching up just before the chapel doors. Or listen near the Queen's stairs, and some swear they've heard weeping. Soft, distant, and never quite traceable. Some say it's Jane Seymour, who died just rooms away after childbirth, her voice still mourning the life she gave for a boy. Anne Boleyn. Her ghost is a little harder to locate. Not at Hampton Court exactly, but elsewhere. The Tower of London, Blickling Hall, Windsor. You might see her as a shadow, a shimmer, a flash of black velvet at the edge of your vision. They say she carries her head. They say she floats, but most likely she simply exists. Somewhere between myth and memory. The staff won't confirm these stories on the record, of course, but they always smile a little too long when asked. And what about Catherine Parr? Her ghost, if it walks, likely does so through libraries, through quiet chapels, through the lines of old books where her signature still curls like a whispered survival spell. You drift now through the tapestried halls, each one bearing faint impressions of a life once lived there. A laugh, a quarrel, a long, silent meal. It's easy to imagine the queens, not as ghosts but as women, tired, hopeful, confused, aware that their decisions would be remembered more for who they married than who they truly were. Historians still argue which wife mattered most, but Hampton Court remembers them all. Each corner of this palace carries a name that once bent the course of history. Each windowpane reflects a world where queens walked a knife's edge between glory and ruin. You pass a room where Anne of Cleves once dined, another where Jane Seymour cradled her newborn son, a courtyard where Catherine Howard may have danced. You feel it all now, the presence of those who left too soon, those who stayed too long, and those who were never given the chance to finish their story. But their stories aren't over. Not really. They linger in textbooks, yes, but also in dreams, in documentaries, in the minds of every curious wanderer who wonders, what was it like? And tonight, as your eyes begin to close, you've come closer than most, because you've walked beside them, listened to them, and maybe understood them just a little better. Now the fire burns low. You're no longer in a palace or a scaffold's shadow. You're safe beneath your blanket, the world outside quiet, the story complete. Your breath slows. Your mind, full of silks and whispers, begins to soften its edges. The queens are quiet now. They've said their piece. Catherine, so proud. Anne, so fierce. Jane, so brief. Anne of Cleves, so wise. Catherine Howard, so young. Catherine Parr, so steady. You've seen them all, not as they were painted, but as they lived, as they hoped, as they tried, failed, endured. Let them rest now. Let the corridors go dark. Let the courtiers fade into shadow. Let the Tudor roses close for the night. There's nothing left to wonder, no more choices to weigh, no more fates to fear. Just soft breath, just silence and sleep. You are safe, you are still. And somewhere in the folds of history, 6 women are sleeping too. No more crowns, no more waiting. Just peace. Good night. 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 Peace. Good night.